1942, somewhere in the Pacific. A young Marine has been awake for nearly 60 hours. His hands don't shake. His vision doesn't blur. He doesn't feel hunger. He barely feels fear. Because he's not just running on adrenaline. He reaches into his breast pocket and takes a pill. A small white tablet, Benzedrine, issued by the US military. And he's not alone. By the end of World War II, American forces had been supplied with an estimated 200 to 250 million amphetamine tablets, distributed through official channels, handed out by medics, and used by soldiers, sailors, and airmen across every major theater of the war. This wasn't rare, it wasn't hidden, and it wasn't accidental. It was sanctioned. When most people picture the American GY of World War II, they imagine discipline, grit, and endurance. And that image is earned. But it's incomplete. Because behind the forced marches, the sleepless bombing missions, and the brutal island fighting, there was another factor at work. Chemistry. Military planners had a problem. Human beings get tired. They break. They hesitate. They fail under prolonged stress. So the question became, what if they didn't have to? The answer came in pills. Stimulants to stay awake, sedatives to come down, morphine for pain, alcohol to cope. An entire, largely unspoken pharmacological system designed not to heal soldiers, but to keep them fighting. We often hear about Nazi Germany's use of methamphetamine during Blitzkrieg. What's discussed far less is that the United States was running its own version of chemical warfare on its own troops, not to harm them, but to push them beyond their natural limits. Because amphetamines don't eliminate exhaustion. They delay it, and eventually, the debt comes due. This is not just a story about drugs. It's a story about what war does to the human body and what institutions are willing to do to keep that body going. Because the American soldier didn't just fight World War II. In many cases, he was chemically engineered to endure it. And when the war ended, those effects didn't simply disappear. Long before the first American boot touched foreign soil in World War II, the drug that would define soldier endurance had already been approved, marketed, and normalized. Benzedrine. That was its commercial name. Developed in the late 1920s by American chemist Gordon Alice, who was searching for a synthetic substitute for ephedrine, a compound used to treat asthma. Benzedrine entered civilian life not as a stimulant of abuse, but as a mundane medical product. An inhaler, available over the counter at any pharmacy, recommended by doctors, trusted by patients. It opened airways. It relieved congestion. It was ordinary. What it also did, what Alice himself documented in his initial trials, was produce a striking and unmistakable effect on the mind. Alertness, elevated mood, a sense of confidence that went beyond the merely physical. Users reported feeling capable of sustained concentration, of pushing through fatigue, of functioning at high performance when the body should have been demanding rest. This was amphetamine. And by the mid-1930s, it was no longer just an asthma treatment. Smith, Kline, and French, the pharmaceutical company that held the commercial rights, had expanded its applications significantly. Benzedrine was now being marketed for depression, for obesity, for narcolepsy, for a staggering variety of conditions that the medical establishment was still mapping. It was legal. It was profitable. It was everywhere. The military was paying attention. The specific moment when American military planners began seriously considering amphetamines as a performance tool is difficult to pin to a single meeting or memo. What is clear is that by the late 1930s, as the possibility of large-scale conflict became impossible to ignore, the question of soldier endurance was already being studied. Fatigue was one of the oldest enemies in warfare. It had cost campaigns, collapsed offensives, and killed soldiers in conditions that had nothing to do with enemy fire. Armies throughout history had grappled with it. Through coffee, through alcohol, through coca leaves, through sheer brutal discipline. Now there was something better. Something that worked faster, lasted longer, and could be standardized in a tablet small enough to carry in a shirt pocket. The British were the first among Allied forces to formally adopt amphetamine for military use. As early as 1939 and into 1940, the Royal Air Force began issuing Benzedrine tablets to aircrew. Men who needed to maintain alertness over long missions, who could not afford the cognitive drift of exhaustion during combat. The results, as reported internally, were persuasive. Pilots stayed sharp. Reaction times held. The missions that might otherwise have required rotation or rest could be extended. America was watching, and America was already manufacturing the drug at scale. When the United States formally entered the war after December 1941, the transition from civilian pharmaceutical product to military supply item happened with notable speed. The U.S. Army Air Forces were among the earliest adopters, mirroring their British counterparts. Long-range bombing missions demanded crews who could remain operationally effective for 8, 10, 12 hours or more. Sleep was not an available option. Coffee was insufficient. Benzedrine was the answer the military had been quietly assembling toward. Crucially, this was not a covert program. The distribution of amphetamine tablets to American military personnel was sanctioned, documented, and organized through official medical supply channels. The Army had pharmacological consultants. There were internal debates about dosage, about frequency, about contraindications. There was a bureaucratic apparatus around this. It was not something happening in the shadows. It was something happening in the supply chain. And yet, despite that bureaucratic normalcy, soldiers who received a Benzedrine tablet were rarely given detailed information about long-term effects. You're tired. This will help. Take it. Move. The full picture of what that tablet was doing, to the body, to the mind, to the man who would eventually have to come home and live a peacetime life. That picture was not part of the briefing. It was the beginning of a pattern, and the pattern was only going to deepen. Numbers matter here. Not as statistics to be recited, but as the architecture of a reality that is almost impossible to grasp without them. During the course of World War II, the United States military distributed an estimated 250 million amphetamine tablets to its service members. 250 million. Produced primarily by Smith, Kline, and French, the same company that had brought Benzedrine to the civilian market, and distributed through military medical channels. These tablets reached soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines across every major theater of the war: the Pacific, North Africa, Italy, France, the skies over Germany. This was not a fringe program. It was not an experiment run on a subset of volunteers. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the largest pharmacological interventions in the history of modern warfare. To understand how this was possible, how it was accepted, how it was sustained, you have to understand the military medicine landscape of the early 1940s. The U.S. Army's approach to pharmacological performance enhancement was embedded within a broader framework of managing the human body as a strategic resource. Vitamin supplements, ration formulations, anti-malarial drugs. The soldier's body was a system to be optimized, and the medical establishment was the engineering department. Benzedrine, and later Dexedrine, a more potent variant, fit naturally into this framework. It was not presented as a drug in the contemporary, loaded sense of that word. It was presented as a tool, a piece of equipment like a canteen or a compass, designed to help the soldier perform his function. Field commanders had considerable discretion in how and when amphetamines were distributed. In the Army Air Forces, Benzedrine was often provided to aircrew before long missions as a matter of routine. Sometimes dispensed directly by flight surgeons, sometimes made available in bulk with the understanding that crews would self-administer. In ground combat units, distribution was less uniform, but no less real. Army medical officers carried amphetamine tablets in their field kits. Soldiers who needed to stay awake during extended operations, who needed to suppress fear before an assault, who needed to march through the night after 3 days without rest. They had access. The Navy operated its own parallel system. Submarine crews on extended patrols operated under conditions of extreme psychological and physical stress. Confined, underwater, operating in near total secrecy for weeks at a time. Amphetamines were part of the pharmacological toolkit deployed to manage that stress and maintain operational capability. Marine Corps units in the Pacific, fighting in the kind of terrain and conditions that made the European theater look almost orderly by comparison, received amphetamines through similar channels. The island-hopping campaigns of 1942 through 1945, conducted in tropical heat against an enemy who frequently refused to surrender, placed demands on the human body that no military planner had fully anticipated. Sleep deprivation became a form of attrition in itself. Amphetamines were one response. The drug also had a civilian dimension that the military had to navigate carefully. Benzedrine was still being produced for and sold to civilian consumers. The same pharmaceutical infrastructure that supplied the military continued supplying American pharmacies. There was no formal separation of military-grade from civilian-grade product. It was the same tablet, the same formulation, moving through different channels. That continuity had implications for the post-war period that no one was yet tracking. And underneath the official distribution, something else was already beginning to happen. Something the supply chain could not fully contain. Soldiers who had been issued Benzedrine tablets began sharing them informally, trading them, using them in contexts that fell outside the sanctioned parameters. A tablet meant to sustain alertness during a combat operation might be used to push through a punishing march. A supply that a flight surgeon had dispensed for mission use might circulate among ground personnel who had no formal authorization but considerable need. The infrastructure of official distribution had created something it had not intended, a military culture in which chemical stimulation was normal, expected, not questioned. The man who reached into his pocket at the beginning of this documentary, 60 hours awake, hands steady, feeling nothing, was not an aberration. He was the product of a system that had decided, with the best of intentions and the worst of long-term thinking, that the answer to human limitation was chemistry. But what was that chemistry actually doing to the men who took it? And what happened when the doses ran out? To understand what amphetamine did to the American soldier, you have to understand what it was doing to the brain. Benzedrine, amphetamine, works by flooding the central nervous system with dopamine and norepinephrine, the neurochemicals associated with alertness, motivation, and the suppression of fatigue. The effect is not subtle. Within 30 to 60 minutes of ingestion, a user experiences a pronounced elevation in energy and mood, a dramatic reduction in the perception of tiredness, an increase in confidence, and a narrowing of focus that can feel, in the moment, like clarity. For a soldier on hour 40 of a combat operation, that effect was not merely pleasant. It was functionally life-saving. The math was straightforward. A man who could not stay awake might miss the enemy patrol. A pilot whose reflexes had degraded from exhaustion might not pull out of the dive in time. A gunner whose hands had begun to shake might miss the shot that mattered. Amphetamine addressed those failures with chemical precision. The accounts left by veterans and documented in military medical records reflect this. Soldiers described the tablet as producing a state of readiness that felt almost unnatural, a suspension of the body's ordinary demands. Hunger disappeared. Cold became manageable. Fear, if not eliminated, became something that could be set aside. An army report from the North African theater noted that soldiers issued Benzedrine before a night operation reported feeling fresh and alert after periods of continuous duty that would ordinarily have rendered them unfit for further service. Air crews in the 8th Air Force conducting daylight bombing raids deep into Germany, missions that could last 8 to 10 hours at altitude under continuous fighter attack in temperatures far below zero, relied on Benzedrine as a standard component of mission preparation. Flight surgeons documented cases in which crews who had been awake for more than 24 hours prior to a mission performed at levels indistinguishable from rested personnel, at least by the metrics available to wartime medicine. But the pharmacological reality was more complicated than those immediate reports suggested. Amphetamine does not eliminate fatigue. It masks it. The neurochemical debt that the drug defers does not disappear. It accumulates. A soldier who has used Benzedrine to push through 48 hours of continuous operation has not solved the problem of exhaustion. He has delayed it. When the drug wears off, typically 4 to 8 hours after ingestion, the crash that follows is often worse than the original fatigue would have been. Deeper, harder to shake, accompanied in many cases by irritability, paranoia, and a cognitive fog that can persist for hours. Military medical officers were aware of this dynamic, at least in theory. Official guidance cautioned against excessive use and emphasized that amphetamines were a tool for specific, defined circumstances, not a substitute for rest, but guidance and practice diverged considerably in the field. When a unit was engaged in continuous operations and rest was not an option, the official caution about overuse became, in practical terms, irrelevant. You took the pill because you had to. You dealt with the crash when it came, if it came, after the operation was over. What military medicine was less prepared to document and less willing to confront were the psychological effects that extended amphetamine use could produce. Anxiety, heightened aggression. In cases of prolonged use or high dosage, something approaching psychosis, paranoid ideation, auditory hallucinations, a detachment from ordinary reality that went well beyond the intended therapeutic effect. These effects were not hypothetical. They appeared in medical records, in after-action reports, in the accounts of unit commanders who noted behavioral changes in men who had been issued stimulants over extended periods. The language used in official documentation was careful, clinical, and deliberately measured. But the underlying reality it described was not. There were also the cases that never made it into official records. Soldiers who had used amphetamines heavily during a campaign and returned to their units afterward in a condition that their commanding officers described variously as unreliable, erratic, or unfit for frontline duty. Men whose sleep had been so thoroughly disrupted by the drugs, by the war, by the interaction between the two, that even when rest was available, it did not come. And then there were the substances beyond Benzedrine. Because amphetamine was not the only drug moving through the American military supply chain. It was the most organized, the most sanctioned, the most systematically distributed. But it was not alone. The amphetamine story is the most documented chapter of American military drug use in World War II. But it is not the only chapter. And to tell only that chapter would be to tell an incomplete story, one that misses the texture of what pharmacological dependence actually looked like across a military of more than 12 million men fighting in conditions that the human nervous system was never designed to sustain. Alcohol had always been part of military culture. This was not a World War II phenomenon. It was a feature of organized armed conflict stretching back centuries. Soldiers drank before battle. They drank after battle. They drank during the long, grinding stretches of inactivity that military life involved as much as combat. In the American military of World War II, alcohol occupied a complex institutional position. officially regulated, unofficially tolerated, and in practice available in quantities that ranged from modest to staggering depending on unit, location, and command culture. The Army and Navy maintained different policies. Navy regulations permitted the ceremonial distribution of spirits under defined circumstances, a tradition with deep historical roots. The Army was nominally drier, officially discouraging alcohol consumption while simultaneously acknowledging that the practical enforcement of that policy was somewhere between difficult and impossible. In practice, soldiers found alcohol through military canteens that sold beer, through local acquisition in whatever country they happened to be stationed, and through the informal economies that spring up around any large concentration of men with money and time. In the Pacific, where many of the island campaigns took place far from functioning supply chains, homebrew operations became common. Servicemen improvised fermented beverages from whatever ingredients were available. Canned fruit, sugar, anything that would produce alcohol given enough time and improvisation. This was documented, tolerated at the unit level, and quietly ignored at higher command. What was less officially documented was the degree to which alcohol consumption served a psychological function that the military had no other mechanism to address. Combat stress, what we now call post-traumatic stress, though that term did not exist in the 1940s, was a clinical reality that military medicine understood poorly and treated inadequately. Men who had survived prolonged combat, who had watched friends die, who had themselves killed at close range, returned to rest areas with a neurological and psychological burden that debriefs and rest could not reach. Alcohol reached it, not by resolving the underlying trauma, but by temporarily suspending it. And in 1943, with no better tool available, temporary suspension was the only option the military medicine cabinet contained. Morphine presents a different and darker dimension of this story. Military medicine's relationship with opiates in World War II was shaped by the immediate imperatives of battlefield medicine. Morphine was, and remains, one of the most effective analgesics available to combat medics, capable of managing the severe pain of gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns, and amputations in conditions where any form of advanced care was hours or days away. Every field medic carried morphine syrettes, small single-dose injectors that could be administered quickly and reliably in the field. Soldiers knew what they were. Many had received morphine from medics after being wounded. The issue was not the use of morphine for its intended medical purpose. That use was necessary, documented, and medically defensible. The issue was what happened at the boundary between therapeutic use and dependence, particularly in men who had received morphine repeatedly over extended periods of wound treatment or hospitalization. Military medicine had protocols designed to minimize the risk of opioid dependence in wounded soldiers. The protocols were not always followed with the rigor that the risk demanded. Hospital systems operating under extreme pressure, with patient loads that far exceeded their designed capacity, did not always have the bandwidth to track individual patients' morphine exposure with the granularity necessary to prevent the development of physical dependence. Some men who passed through field hospitals and evacuation systems in the Pacific or in Europe emerged on the other side with a physiological relationship to opiates that no one had intended to create. There was also a third category of substance that belongs in this history, though it sits in a different register from amphetamines, alcohol, and morphine. In the Pacific Theater, the interaction between American forces and local populations introduced some soldiers to substances that had no equivalent in the Western pharmacopoeia. Cannabis use, documented in both the Pacific and North African theaters, was common enough that it appeared regularly in court-martial records and military police reports. It was informal, unsanctioned, and in many cases treated by command authorities as a disciplinary rather than medical matter. But it was present. It was part of the landscape. What all of these substances shared, the amphetamines, the alcohol, the morphine, the informal acquisitions, was a single, common function: They were mechanisms for managing what the war was doing to the human nervous system. They were ways of getting through, of enduring, of remaining functional, or at least remaining present, in conditions that the body and mind were not built to survive. And that function tells us something important, not about moral failure, not about weakness, but about the distance between what we ask of human beings in war and what human beings are actually capable of bearing. If the use of amphetamines and other substances in the American military during World War II was as extensive as the records suggest, one question presses insistently. What did the medical establishment know? And when? The answer is not comfortable, but it is important. American military medicine in World War II was a vast, sophisticated enterprise, far more organized and scientifically rigorous than its predecessors. The Surgeon General's office coordinated pharmacological research with pharmaceutical companies. Medical officers at the divisional and corps level provided regular reports on health conditions within their units. Research programs, funded by the War Department, examined the physiological and psychological effects of combat conditions on soldier performance. This was not a primitive system flying blind. It was a modern institutional apparatus with access to significant data. That data included information about the effects of amphetamine use. The Army Air Forces, which used Benzedrine most systematically, also studied it most carefully. Flight surgeons filed regular reports. The School of Aviation Medicine conducted research on the cognitive and physiological effects of stimulant use in aircrew. There was genuine scientific inquiry happening alongside the operational deployment. What that inquiry revealed was partially encouraging and partially concerning. The short-term performance benefits were real and measurable. Amphetamine use did sustain alertness. It did improve performance on tasks requiring sustained attention, the kind of tasks that long-duration bombing missions demanded. The data supporting operational use was solid, and it was used to justify continued distribution. The concerning findings received a different treatment. Reports of post-mission crashes, of behavioral changes in men who had used stimulants over extended periods, of sleep disruption that persisted after operational necessity, had passed. These findings were documented. They were circulated within the medical establishment, and they were, in most cases, treated as manageable costs rather than disqualifying contraindications. The framing was always operational. The question was not whether Benzedrine caused harm, but whether the harm it caused was less than the harm that would result from the exhaustion it prevented. In wartime, that calculus consistently resolved in favor of continued use. The immediate, measurable cost of not using amphetamines, missions failed, crews lost, operations collapsed, was visible and specific. The diffuse, longer-term cost of using them, men who came home with disrupted sleep, altered mood, and a complicated relationship to their own neurochemistry, was invisible, deferred, and distributed across a veteran population that would not begin to manifest those costs in visible ways for months or years. This is not to suggest that military medicine acted in bad faith. The physicians and researchers who built and operated this system were, for the most part, men who genuinely believed they were serving their patients as well as circumstances permitted. The choices made in 1942 looked different from the inside of a war than they look from the outside of it, 7 decades later. But the medical establishment made choices about what to emphasize and what to defer. It chose to prioritize operational performance data over long-term safety data because the operational data was what the commanders needed and the long-term data did not yet exist in the forms that would have demanded attention. It chose to distribute a pharmacologically significant substance to millions of men without a framework for tracking individual exposure, individual response, or individual need for post-use support. And it chose, with very few exceptions, not to tell the men who were taking the tablets very much about what they were taking. The consent framework that a contemporary medical ethics standard would require was simply absent. A soldier issued a Benzedrine tablet and told it would help him stay awake was not given a briefing on dopamine and norepinephrine. He was not warned about the crash that would follow, or the sleep disruption that might persist, or the small but real risk that extended use might leave him with a relationship to this chemical that would not end when the war did. He was given a pill. He was told to take it. He was trusted to be a soldier. And here is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because the men who came home from World War II came home as the greatest generation. They came home to parades and monuments and a civilian economy that needed them. They came home to wives and children and suburbs and a cultural narrative that had no room for the complicated truth of what the war had done to them. And tucked inside that complicated truth, in many cases unrecognized by the men themselves, was a pharmacological history that no one had prepared them to understand, address, or heal. The war ended in 1945. The soldiers came home, and the story of what the drugs had done to them was supposed to end there too. It did not. The transition from military to civilian life for the veterans of World War II has been mythologized in American culture to a degree that has made it difficult to see clearly. The GI Bill, the new suburbs, the baby boom, the economic expansion. The image is one of seamless reinsertion, men who had been soldiers becoming fathers, workers, citizens, with a speed and completeness that seemed to confirm something essential about American character and resilience. The image was not false. For many veterans, the transition was, by the standards available to them, successful. They built lives. They raised families. They contributed to a nation that genuinely needed them. But inside those lives, for a significant and largely uncounted number of men, something did not resolve. Something from the war remained. Not as memory, necessarily, but as neurochemistry, as pattern, as a relationship between the self and chemical stimulation that had been established during 4 years of sanctioned and encouraged use. The research on post-war amphetamine dependence among World War II veterans is frustratingly incomplete. This is not accidental. The medical infrastructure of the post-war Veterans Administration was organized around visible physical injury. The wound, the amputation, the disease. Psychological and neurochemical consequences of the war were understood poorly, tracked inadequately, and treated minimally. A veteran who returned from the Pacific with disrupted sleep patterns, irritability, mood instability, and a tendency to seek out Benzedrine, still available over the counter at American pharmacies until 1959, did not present at a VA clinic as a man with a drug problem rooted in military service. He presented, if he presented at all, as a man who was having trouble adjusting. The adjustment framework was the dominant lens through which post-war veteran difficulties were viewed. The concept of what we now call addiction, understood neurobiologically, understood as a consequence of specific exposure histories, was not the framework that 1945 American medicine applied to these men. The science did not yet exist in the form that would have enabled it. What we can reconstruct from the available data, pharmaceutical sales records, VA health statistics, civilian medical reports from the late 1940s and 1950s, is a picture that is suggestive, if not definitive. Amphetamine use in the American civilian population rose significantly after the war. The drug remained legally available and widely marketed. By the early 1950s, amphetamine prescriptions in the United States numbered in the tens of millions annually. The precise degree to which this civilian demand was driven by veteran populations cannot be established with certainty from the available records. But the coincidence of timing and scale is not something that can be dismissed. The morphine story has a similar shadow. The veterans who had developed physical dependence on opiates through wound treatment and hospitalization did not always receive the structured support that such dependence required. The post-war VA system was overwhelmed, underfunded, and operating with a therapeutic toolkit that was, by contemporary standards. Primitive. Men who needed medically supervised withdrawal received in many cases nothing more than a discharge and an address. The alcohol dimension is perhaps the most visible and the most commonly acknowledged of the post-war consequences. Rates of alcohol dependence among World War II veterans were substantially elevated compared to the general male population of similar age. This is documented in epidemiological studies conducted from the late 1940s through the 1960s. The relationship between combat exposure, psychological trauma, and alcohol use as a coping mechanism was observed, noted, and, in the cultural context of the immediate post-war period, largely excused as the understandable consequence of what these men had been through. What was not observed, not named, and not treated was the role that the military's own pharmacological infrastructure had played in establishing the conditions for these post-war patterns. The men who drank heavily after the war were not simply men who had seen terrible things. They were, in many cases, men whose neurochemical systems had been significantly altered by years of sanctioned drug use, who had been sent home without any framework for understanding what had happened to them, and who had found in alcohol a substance that produced effects, sedation, mood alteration, anxiety relief, that substituted, however inadequately, for the pharmacological support their nervous systems had been trained to expect. This is not exculpation. It is not a claim that every veteran who struggled after World War II struggled because of drugs. The war itself, the violence, the loss, the moral weight of what these men had witnessed and done, was a sufficient cause of profound psychological difficulty without any pharmacological dimension at all. But it is a claim that the pharmacological dimension existed, that it was real, that it was created in significant part by decisions made within the institutional apparatus of the American military and its medical establishment, and that those decisions and their consequences were never honestly reckoned with by the institutions that made them. The men deserved that reckoning. They did not receive it. The history of American military drug use in World War II did not end in 1945. It continued in the Korean War, in Vietnam, in the institutional memory of a military that had learned during the largest conflict in human history that pharmacological performance enhancement was possible, effective, and organizationally manageable. The lessons of World War II were not formally codified into doctrine in a way that created a clean, traceable lineage, but they were absorbed. The military medicine apparatus that had distributed 250 million Benzedrine tablets during World War II did not disband after 1945. It restructured, retained its institutional knowledge, and carried that knowledge forward into the next conflict. In Korea, amphetamine use among American military personnel continued, again through both official and informal channels. In Vietnam, the pharmacological landscape became considerably more complex. Amphetamines, yes, but also cannabis on a massive scale, and heroin, and a range of other substances that the military's own drug culture had helped normalize. The Vietnam drug crisis, which became a public scandal by the early 1970s, was not a sudden development. It was an accumulation, a system that had been built in World War II that had normalized pharmacological intervention as a tool of military management, that had never honestly confronted its own long-term costs, had metastasized over 2 decades into something that could no longer be contained within the supply chain. The pharmaceutical industry's relationship with military performance enhancement also persisted and evolved. The same scientific framework that had produced Benzedrine and Dexedrine continued to develop, producing new generations of stimulants, some legal, some not, that made the wartime amphetamines look rudimentary by comparison. The basic insight that human performance could be chemically enhanced beyond its ordinary biological limits became a permanent feature of both military research and civilian pharmaceutical development. It is worth pausing here to consider what this history means. not as a condemnation of the men who made these decisions, but as an honest accounting of what those decisions produced. The American military of World War II made a rational choice. Faced with the genuine problem of human limitation in the face of extraordinary operational demand, it reached for the best available pharmacological tool and deployed it at scale. The tool worked in the narrow terms that wartime assessment could measure. Missions were completed, operations were sustained. Men who would otherwise have collapsed from exhaustion remained functional. What that rational choice cost? In the long-term health of individual veterans, in the patterns of substance use that followed these men home, in the institutional normalization of pharmacological manipulation as a solution to human limitation, that cost was never placed on the ledger against the operational benefits. And that asymmetry between the visible, measurable, immediate benefits of chemical performance enhancement and the invisible, diffuse, long-term costs borne by individual human beings is not a World War II problem. It is not a problem that ended in 1945 or 1975 or at any other historical marker. It is a problem that recurs wherever human beings are asked to perform beyond their biological limits and wherever an institutional authority decides that the question of how to make that performance possible is more urgent than the question of what it will ultimately cost. The Benzedrine tablet in the American soldier's pocket was not evil. It was a tool designed by scientists, distributed by physicians, issued by an institution that genuinely believed, it was helping. The men who took it were not weak. They were not reckless. They were soldiers, doing what soldiers do, using what they had been given to survive. But the institution that gave it to them owed them something more than a tablet and a mission. It owed them honesty about what the tablet was. It owed them a framework for understanding and addressing the effects that would outlast the mission. It owed them the recognition that the debt deferred by that small white pill would eventually come due, not to the army, not to the pharmaceutical company, not to the historians who would eventually piece this story together, but to the men themselves. Many of them paid that debt alone, in living rooms in the late 1940s, in VA waiting rooms in the 1950s, in the quiet, unacknowledged suffering of men who had been taught to endure, had been chemically equipped to endure, and had never been taught what to do when the endurance finally ran out. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over difficult history. Not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of preference. The preference to remember things as simpler than they were. To hold the image of the greatest generation intact, uncomplicated, worthy of the monuments built in their honor. They are worthy of those monuments. Nothing in this history diminishes what American soldiers accomplished in World War II. The sacrifice was real. The victory was real. The moral stakes of that conflict were as clear as any in modern history. But the men who fought it were human beings, not symbols, not archetypes. Human beings who were placed in conditions that exceeded human biological capacity, who were given chemical tools to bridge that gap, and who carried the consequences of those tools long after the war that created them had ended. The record of American military drug use in World War II is not a scandal to be hidden. It is a chapter of human experience that deserves to be read honestly. It tells us something about war, about what it requires of the people who fight it. It tells us something about institutions, about how they manage the distance between what they ask of people and what they owe them. And it tells us something about the peculiar moral arithmetic of necessity, the way that urgent need in times of crisis has a habit of borrowing against futures that someone else will have to pay. 250 million tablets, distributed, consumed, forgotten. The men who took them are mostly gone now. The records are partial, the consequences dispersed across decades and lives too ordinary to attract the attention of history. But they happened. The debt was real. And the least we can offer to the men who carried it is the honesty to say so. This is not just history. It is an account still being settled. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.